Hello, everyone. I'm glad you joined me for this particular message. This is a message from Proverbs, chapter 14, and we're going to be looking at verse 4 primarily, but also a little bit of interest in verse 23 of chapter 13. But Proverbs is one of those difficult books to understand. When I was a teenager, I read the book of Proverbs for the very first time. It was difficult to understand all the Proverbs. In fact, an awful lot of them I couldn't understand. And many of them, it didn't really help that I had read them in the King James Version, which is still very complicated English for most of us to understand. But it was a good expression. I came across several different Proverbs that gave me a lot of trouble. One of them was in chapter 26, verses 4 and 5, where it says, "Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself." And then in the very next verse it says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes." And I thought, boy, those sound awful contradictory. How does that make sense? But as I've grown older, I've come to understand that what Solomon was getting at there was the concept of timing and circumstances. There is a time, as he would say later in Ecclesiastes, for everything. And there is a time to answer somebody who's being foolish, and then there is a time just to ignore it and let it be, because all you can do is stoop to their level. So it's important for us as individuals to understand that concept in our daily life. But there is one proverb that really, as a teenager, got under my skin, and I wondered what in the world was that about. It's found in Proverbs chapter 14, verse 4. And in that particular verse, we read, "Where there are no oxen, the manger is clean, but abundant crops come by the strength of the ox." There are several different translations, and some translations make it a little easier to understand. I like the New Living Translation that says, "Without oxen, a stable stays clean, but you need a strong ox for a large harvest." But it still doesn't give us an idea of what that really is all about. One of the things that helps us, though, is in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 6, the men who compiled Solomon's Proverbs into this book told us about the value or the types of proverbs or wise sayings. They tell us that there are actually three types, one which is covered by the general term of proverb, which means a wise saying with a metaphorical meaning. But there is also another type, which is a satire or a taunt or a mocking statement. And we don't often think of those as proverbs or wise sayings, but satire was part of the Proverbs. In fact, if you read some of the Proverbs, they are very clearly satire. But the last type is a type that is a riddle or an obscure saying or a puzzle, as it were. It is something to make you think deeply about what's being said and to try and understand its meaning or its purpose. And this particular proverb fits into that category. And that's important for us to understand as we try to unpack it, as it were, in our present circumstance. One of the things that struck me about all this is messiness. I've been reading several articles about messy desks and messy circumstances in our workspace, and I thought about how we often think of messiness as being a detriment to the process of creativity or production. But some of the studies have led to an understanding that certain types of messiness, that if you could put them as chaotic order, or the idea of being in proximity to things that are not always put in nice little neat stacks. That helps us sometimes develop creativity. Lee Strobel, in his book, The Case for Faith, used a phrase that really caught my attention. He used the concept of the universe as a soul-making machine, and that really caught my imagination. I am an avid reader of C.S. Lewis and an avid reader of G.K. Chesterton. If you have never read G.K. Chesterton, I recommend you read him, but he'll make your head hurt. He has a lot of thinking. And when I came across him, I came across a man that I believe thought an awful lot like Solomon thought. He kind of loved the concept of paradox. And when you read Solomon's writings in the Proverbs and even in Song of Songs and even in the book of Ecclesiastes, you meet a man that loves paradox. He enjoys paradox and irony and its fullness. And as you read him, you have to understand that about his personality. And so when you approach an understanding of the Proverbs, that's important in that process. What all three of these authors talked about was the concept that this universe is at times a messy place. It is messy for a number of different reasons, but ultimately the concept is that the only way in which God could create beings that could spend eternity with him, could have a sense of purpose and direction, required that he allow some messiness in the universe. Some of that messiness included the idea of allowing us free will, that we could make decisions. We could make a decision to love God or to hate him. We could make a decision to treat his creation with respect or treat it with complete contempt. And those things are choices that we have. And they introduce messiness into the universe. God allowed that because we were important to him. He also allowed humanity to fall because he considered our ability to love and our ability to care and to love him with a full and open heart as more important in his economy. And that is a powerful truth for us. God was willing to allow this messiness, this at times suffering, this at times difficulty, because he thought you and I, as full people, as persons, were worth that risk. That changes our entire understanding because God is interested in making souls. Messiness is part of that making souls. It is part of that process of God making eternal beings that can have relationship with him throughout eternity. A world ruled by efficiency alone is a very bleak, bleak place. And as Christians, we do not want that type of world. God did not want that type of world. He involved himself in the messiness of our world by becoming human in Jesus Christ and dwelling among us, getting caught up in the messiness of our world, in the suffering, in the difficulty, in the problems. In fact, the writer of Hebrews would say he became perfected through this process of becoming human. That changes our whole understanding of this messy world. What Solomon is talking about is that if you have a clean barn and the trough is not messy, there's no slobber in it from the cattle, there is no overflow of the grain on the ground, attracting vermin like rats and mice at times, and there is no manure spread around the barn floor. A clean barn may seem pretty nice, but if you don't have the ox to do the work of plowing the field and hauling in the grain sheaves, and ultimately, as Deuteronomy tells us, to tread out that grain, to thresh the grain, you don't have any real value. And that's what it means in a messy world. It is not always a clean and comfortable and easy circumstance. But God didn't call us to that. He calls us as people to engage in this world with all of its messiness, with all of its problems, with all of its difficulties, and all of its struggles. In Luke's Gospel, chapter 2, we are told that Jesus came and was laid in a manger, a messy place. It may even have still had cattle slobber all over it. There probably were vermin working their way like mice around, trying to pick up what little scraps they could from the floor. There was probably also animal dung. All of those things were part of that. It was messy. But then God embraced that messiness because he wanted to save us. He was even willing to die for us in that mess. And that is the glory of living in a messy world. Thank you for listening. God bless you. And God loves you. Have a wonderful day.